Joining us all the way from the UK via video link, please welcome Jason Maude.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear well. I'm the founder of a company called Isabel Healthcare, and we're all about tools to help you with diagnosis. So I think I should mention, with all the talk that goes on about AI in medicine, this is a tool that's very much about helping you make you a smarter doctor and not try to replace things that you do and try and mimic what you do. It's just really to help you become much smarter and essentially get to the right diagnosis quicker. So there's a story to the tool. You might wonder why it's called Isabel. Is a sort of an odd word for a medical tool, but it starts with a story. Sorry, just trying to get the slide on one. Yeah, it starts with a story of my daughter, Isabel, who was, you can see in this next slide, started in 1999, and my daughter was in 3.5. And the clinicians missed a secondary infection. Now, I'm just going to show you a short clip of a film that was made by the BBC quite recently, which gives you a very good summary of what happened, the story, and then I'll talk a little bit about some of the features afterwards. So we'll just run the video.
When I was at medical school, one of the most important things they taught us was how to make a diagnosis, how to pull all the clues together and decide what's wrong. Now, most of the time, doctors get the diagnosis right. Sometimes, tragically, they don't.
As Jason and Charlotte Maude discovered in 1999 when their daughter fell seriously ill.
Isabel got chickenpox when she was 3, so we took her to the GP, who really wasn't worried at all.
But Isabel's condition deteriorated rapidly.
The spots on her tummy had gone purple. She had green vomit. She was in a mess.
And she was rushed to A&E.
The next time we saw her, she was on full life support, struggling for her life. We couldn't understand why one minute we'd been told she got chickenpox and the next she was at death's door.
It wasn't until Isabel was taken to a specialist unit that doctors diagnosed the problem. Isabel had a rare secondary infection, the vicious flesh-eating bacteria, necrotizing fasciitis. To save her life, Isabel needed major surgery to remove the infected areas. It's taken her years to recover.
I'll be having my last reconstructive surgery in September this year.
That's a lot of operations, isn't it?
Yeah, 18 years worth of operations.
And do you think if they had been able to make the diagnosis earlier, it would have made a difference?
Yes, it definitely would have. A lot of physical and emotional trauma from one stupid mistake.
But one thing that video highlights, and you'll see the time, as I mentioned to clinicians who sometimes don't think about these issues, that a mistake like this casts a very long shadow on the family. So, you know, this has cast a shadow lasting 18 years. So what was quite interesting is that my background was in finance. I had no idea about medicine. And it was only when Isabel got transferred to the intensive care unit that the doctor said, you guys weren't very well looked after. And that's what planted the seed in my mind, trying to understand why she got misdiagnosed. I thought all doctors were very experienced and knew everything. And so I started to realize that certainly in the UK, when you go to an emergency department in the UK, you see very junior doctors initially. And when you go and see the primary care doctor, I began to realize that they see day-to-day very, a wide range. They're seeing neonates to 90-year-olds and very routine things. So I thought, this is a really hard job. How do these people, particularly junior doctors in your position that are very inexperienced, how do you recognize a disease which is rare and unusual? I'm sure a lot of doctors very rarely see a case of necrotizing fasciitis. And also, you know, with kids, they're always ill in the middle of the night. Then you have to call in your consultant in the middle of the night, drag him back from his home and probably be told that it was a stupid mistake and he shouldn't have done that. So what I thought was, surely clinicians need some sort of checklist. Wouldn't that be great if you had a doubt about somebody's diagnosis, you could type in the signs and symptoms, press a button, and get a list of potential diagnoses, things to think about, act as a sort of safety list or a checklist. And that was the original idea. That was the kernel of the idea. I knew about certain sort of software and I had an idea of how to make it. So we started this journey in 2000 in making a tool that would do this job. So what we are today, and it's very important, I guess, the story as to why we do this. So although we are a company, we're probably more of a social enterprise, we do this as a mission to try and help clinicians get to the right diagnosis quicker. We started out as a charity because at that point I was really just an annoyed father, and friends would say to me when I talked about this tool that surely clinicians are using this. It's just so obvious that people must be using it all the time. And then when I said talk to the doctors, they would say, yeah, it's a great idea, but guess what? The doctors won't use it. So I thought, well, let's start this out as a charity and take away every possible reason for people not to use it. So we started out as a charity in 1999 and first made the tool available for pediatrics in 2001. It wasn't sustainable on a charitable basis, so we converted it into a business in 2004. And that gave us money to build the adult version as well. So today we're a social enterprise. We are, I think, the accepted leader in diagnosis decision support systems, not just for clinicians. We started out making this available for clinicians, but then we also developed a patient version, which became available in 2012. Today it's used mainly by hospitals and health systems in the US, from primary care practices to right up to academic medical centers like Geisinger, Maine Medical Center. And it's also used within the state of Queensland. So let's start to look at what Isabel is. I call it an enhanced deep learning system. And it's actually incredibly accurate. I'm very proud about the level of accuracy and what Isabel can cope with. And just to give you an idea of this, we actually, over the last couple of years, we collected 563 real cases of misdiagnosis. So these are cases either reported in the journals, or if there was a press article, but it was a good quality article from something like the Washington Post, where there was a lot of detail and a known final diagnosis. Now, these were quite complex cases. They all had 6 symptoms on average, and they covered 300 different diagnoses. And so we ran them through the Isabel system. And you can see in the middle, I don't know whether it's clear enough, but you can see, a sort of typical case where there's quite a lot of detail entered. But what we found was that in 74% of those cases, the correct diagnosis appeared in the top 3 positions, which I thought was amazing out of all those cases. And in 98% of those cases were covered by the top 10 suggestions. The remaining 2% were within the next 4 positions. So there were no diagnoses missed out. They were all covered and all in a very prominent position. And also they were highlighted as more likely. So you'll see, I'll show you in a bit more detail later, we introduce a bar to try and highlight which diagnoses are more likely and less likely, to help you sort of hone down where the diagnoses are. So what makes Isabel unique? Because there are a lot of, you're probably starting to see tools like this appear more, particularly for patients. There are a lot of tools now for patients. Isabel is very different because it's, first of all, it's a deep learning system. And I'll go into why that's important. It's important to see how these tools are made, and because it determines their capabilities. But the key thing it does is it enables you to enter multiple symptoms, multiple clinical features in free text. which I think is a big difference. A lot of symptom checkers can only cope with one symptom, which seems to me fairly useless. The accuracy, as I showed you, is outstanding, combined with the breadth of coverage. The way the system is built allows it to cover a much broader range of diseases. So we're covering a total 10,000 diagnoses, of which 6,000 are diseases and 4,000 are drugs. And the other thing is its ability to integrate into other systems. So we are integrating into systems like Cerner that you'll be using, Epic, and all the other electronic systems. We publish our API to make it easy to integrate into other tools. This is something we all thought from the very beginning that Isabel would be the sort of Intel inside. And the other things, with these tools appearing, there's a lot of criticism that they're not validated. Well, we took that process very seriously and have actually been doing that from the very beginning. Our first paper appeared in 2002. So it's been, for us, it's been a continual process all the way through the development of the system. So I want to talk a little bit about the deep learning, because it's important to understand how these tools are made and what makes them different. So virtually all tools of this type are what we call rules-based systems. And that means they're based on a very large decision tree. And some tools have bigger decision trees than others. But the problem with a decision tree is it tends to take you through a very long, laborious set of questions. So what Isabel is doing is essentially what you do as a human being. When you see a patient, you elicit the history, you ask them questions, so you pick up a data set of their signs and symptoms. And what you do is you then match that to what you remember, your learning, your reading and experience to come up with your differential list. Now, the problem, obviously, for a human being is you can't remember thousands of diseases. And in this day and age, kind of why should you? You know, your memory will, I think a lot of the process for diagnosis can be quite random. And sometimes people get diagnosed because of some obscure story that a doctor happened to see a patient somewhere on his travels in Africa and so remembered a case like that. But that shouldn't be how diagnosis is done. So if you look on the left-hand side, what we're using is, well, if you look at the whole, we're using essentially three technologies. So the first on the left-hand side is we're using statistical natural language processing. This is a very, very clever software which understands the meaning and context of language. And also as a byproduct of it, it actually gives additional weight to important symptoms. So if you put in fever, vomiting, diarrhea, okay, those are very common symptoms, but if you then added strawberry tongue, it would give a greater weight because that's quite an unusual symptom. Then if we move to the right-hand side, this is probably the heart of Isabel, is the deep learning section, which is essentially a database of disease presentations. So we've actually trained our database over many years on how diseases present. And what we've done is essentially create the 10,000 diagnoses, and we've extracted the knowledge that the same knowledge that you would read in your textbook about how a disease presents. But the crucial point is our database is trained in natural language. So again, a lot of tools are trained on codified language, and it's very hard to enter natural language into a system that's trained on codified language. So Isabel is unique in terms of the training database, and this is the bit that takes longest with deep learning systems, is based on natural language. And then at the bottom, we have rules which adjust the output of Isabel for the age, the gender, and the region of the patient. Because there are certain diseases that can only be seen in neonates or will only be seen in women. And so as a clinician, you wouldn't expect to be shown those irrelevant diseases. So it's a combination of all these technologies working together. It's like a sort of almost a complex piece of music. And if you take any bit away, the system won't work well. So let's see what it looks like in practice. This is just an example. And here you'll see where these rules come in. So on the left-hand side, we start with clinical features. You have to enter the age of the patient, the gender. You're prompted to think of travel history. So we cover the 12 World Health Organization regions. So you either set the default at where you are, and then you think about where your patient has traveled from. So this is really useful if you're, in Australia and a patient of yours has been to West Africa. You may not be thinking of diseases that are prevalent in West Africa. You can change the travel history region and it'll bring up diseases prevalent in those areas. So you can see where we then enter the signs and symptoms is in this example, we've entered 6 clinical features. And when you type your third letter, you're prompted to think of symptoms. So it comes up with predictive text, or you can carry on writing in free text what the symptom is. Once you're happy, you click Get Checklist, and then on the right-hand side, you'll see this list of diagnoses coming up. Now, Isabel is a differential diagnosis generator, so it's not designed to give you the final diagnosis. It's designed to give you a list of diagnoses to think about, to help you put together a differential diagnosis for your specific patient. So most clinicians would go through this list going, yes, thought about that. Oh, that's not a bad idea. I missed that one. So they're ranked in order of relevance. So this is not clinical probability, but they're ranked in order of how well the features you put in matched our database. Now, because we've been doing this for so long, we find that level of match is actually quite accurate. It's very accurate indeed, and hence the figures I showed you at the beginning of the 74% in the top 3 positions. The bar, orange yellow bar, is designed to highlight the ones that are more likely. So the deep orange at the top, the leg calf Perth disease in this case, is highlighted as the more likely. The osteomyelitis is likely, and then the ones in the yellow are less likely. The red flags are what we call the don't miss diagnoses. And for us, these are diagnoses that if you're thinking about them, you need to do something within the next 48 hours. Otherwise, this patient will be severely harmed or dead. You can sort this list by specialty. So if you see on the extreme right-hand side, you'll see ortho, infectious, neuro. If you think this is just an orthopedic issue, you can click on ortho and you will just get orthopedic suggestions. Now, if you see leg Perth calf disease, you may say, well, I remember reading about that, but I can't remember how it presents. I can't remember all the details. You can then click on it, and what will come up is knowledge from various different evidence-based resources. In this case, we're coming up with Dynamed because we work with publishers like Dynamed, Wolters Kluwer, etc. But on the left-hand side, you'll see what we call the navigation panel, and anything you click will just come up with information about leg calf Perth disease. So Isabel has got 2 key jobs. One is to get you thinking about a disease you never thought about, prompt you about something you probably knew but just weren't thinking about at the time. Classically, people get things wrong where there's an atypical presentation of a common disease. So it's not all about rare diseases. And we found that clinicians, when they used Isabel, in about 17% of the time, they changed their working diagnosis as a result of using it. And 45% of the time, they used it for reassurance. So there's another example. If you click on case reports from PubMed, again, this will give you just the case reports on that particular disease, which should then help you think through the diagnosis a little bit further. This we also have, Isabel, is a responsive design. So if you go to the same site on your mobile phone, it'll resize automatically, and you'll see the same case here. So this is not an app because, as I say, it's responsive. You don't actually need an app. This is how the system resizes and comes up, and you can see exactly the same information on the phone. So I imagine, when you're starting out in medicine and, you're nervous about a patient, this means that even if you're going in the lift from one floor to the other, you could quickly put in the symptoms and have a quick check to see whether, if there's something you've missed, you've not thought about, or then help you when you're put on the spot by your consultant and he says, what's your differential? You'll be able to come up with some good ideas. So as I mentioned, the validation process, this is very important for us. And as I said, it's been a continual process. I think we have, I've lost count, I mean, at least sort of 40 or 50 articles in peer-reviewed journals. What we've done is, I'd say they divide up into three areas. There's the accuracy studies, which on average show that in about 96% of the time, Isabel includes the correct diagnosis in its list. As we developed further, we tried to make it so that final diagnosis appears higher and higher. And that internal study shows, we're getting there. We're doing a pretty good job. The utility study showed that when a clinician used Isabel, in about 10% of those cases, it prompted them to think of an important diagnosis they hadn't thought about. And when we did this live in 3 NHS hospitals, a big proportion of those turned out to be the actual final diagnosis the patient had. And then finally, the impact studies, which are actually the most interesting. We've had some really interesting studies done by the Chicago Medical School, looking at the effect on final year medical students. And what we found is that in about, we increased the diagnostic accuracy of students by about 30%. And they actually did also a very interesting randomized control trial where they divided students into two groups. So one group actually consulted with their resident and the other group consulted with Isabel. And what they found, they gave them 5 or 6 cases. And they found that the group that consulted with their resident actually got slightly less accurate, but more confident. So if, in a way, they were more confident in their wrongness. While the group that looked at Isabel actually became significantly more accurate and appropriately more confident. So it was very, very interesting. You could see the human aspects of when people get together and talk about something and agree on an answer, they become more confident. It doesn't necessarily mean they're more accurate. So that really is a quick run through the Isabel system. We're actually hopefully going to start working on a special clinical reasoning version of the tool, which will combine case-based learning with Isabel and design a really clever tool to help students, help teach them clinical reasoning. But that probably won't be available for probably a year or so. So this is a really important aspect, and very happy to take questions if you have any.
Thanks so much for that, Jason. When I heard about Isabel, I thought this was way too good to be true. And the more I read into it, the more I thought this is the app I really need to have. So I'm sure many of you feel the same way as me. So we're going to take some questions. If anybody has one, can you please raise your hand? We have the lovely Cam and Britt, who will... Excellent.
Howdy. So I just noticed in your, where you put all the inputs in, that there was nothing there for ethnicity, and I thought that maybe given the genetic predisposition for certain diseases to be more likely, that was there a reason that was left out because like the algorithm should pick it up anyway, or that was just something I found interesting?
Yeah, I mean, there isn't a special rule for that in the same way there is for regions, but actually if you put the ethnicity in as part of a clinical feature, then it does actually take account of that. And I think there was a case where, in fact, a pharmaceutical company tried it out and put in a particular case and then put in Jewish, and it came up, I think it was Gaucher's disease, which apparently is more prevalent in that community. But if you put the ethnicity in, it will actually take account of it just in its normal database.
Any more
So
questions?
it's quite fascinating what you can put in. I'd say the key thing is what you can't put in, which are negatives. So no fever, something that's no gets misinterpreted, but and numbers will just get ignored. But you can put in lab results as long as you describe them. So elevated, low, high, neutropenia is fine. So I think it's a question of experimenting, but you can certainly put ethnicity in.
Any other questions from the floor? Yeah. Oh, excellent.
Hi, how you going? Obviously, this is a really good tool for junior doctors and something a lot of us would be probably interested in. Do you think it carries any risk of sort of de-skilling young doctors in practicing these skills themselves and learning to do them before they become more senior?
No, I mean, I think the opposite, in fact, because we don't tell somebody what to do. Some people will give the opposite criticism and say, are you going to overwhelm people? Because, before they used Isabel, they're only thinking of one diagnosis, and now you give them 10, so they're going to become overwhelmed. So I think we stimulate thinking. I mean, that's the whole point of the tool, is it gets you thinking, enables you to read information about it and think it through, and triggers you to ask other questions. So we haven't found that at all. It's occasionally we do get it as a thought, but I wish we had a study to prove that, it didn't do that. But I certainly don't think so at all. It's certainly designed, and the intent, and I think what it does is stimulate thinking, and I think we found people often say Isabel teaches you in the teachable moment. So where it may have an effect is that people will remember that pattern before and say, well, I've seen that in Isabel, so I remember that pattern. So it teaches that in a much more effective way, because it's the very moment you're seeing a patient.
We have a question up there, I believe. No? Any more questions from the floor?
Yeah, there's one more.
Oh, plenty of questions.
I love questions.
Thank you for your talk, Jason. It was very interesting. Deep learning-based systems have sometimes been criticised for lacking in transparency, as in you put in the data, the computer spits out a result and can't explain why. So when things go wrong, when diagnoses do get missed, how can you pinpoint the source of the error and make sure it doesn't happen again?
Yeah, it's a good point, and I think it's a fair point. They'll never be as transparent as a rules-based system. But I think it's, one of the things we've done with Isabel is to make sure that you can click on knowledge to help you read up and try and understand. And we also, if you click, it'll show you the terms that we've used to do the search. So we do make it as transparent as possible. There will always be an element that we can't explain. But I don't think they're any more of a black box than a human being. Interesting enough, I mean, the human brain is a great big black box. But the important thing with these tools is the amount of training they've had and the amount of testing. And that's where, we've been doing this for, almost 20 years. And the database started in 2001. What it means is we've had many years of building the database and many years of testing it with cases. We've tested it with thousands of cases, and also we've got thousands of users, so that people feed back to us if a disease didn't appear. And you probably didn't spot it, but on the list of the results there is a sort of Facebook-like thumbs up, thumbs down sign. So if a clinician's using it and it didn't come up with something, or they thought it was a poor suggestion, they can click the thumbs down sign, and that alerts us behind the scenes, and we can then check how the system performed. We can look at the case and see whether that was, it didn't perform as well as it should. So because we've been doing that for many, many years, I think the tool, we've ironed out, almost everything we possibly could by now. And we still carry on testing it every single day, but that's our sort of process. And I think it's, if somebody comes along with a deep learning system they built 6 months ago, then that's where I would start to worry that they hadn't done the training, hadn't done the testing.
So we've only got time for one more question. Cam, just behind you. Oh, thanks.
I was just wondering, how widely is Isabel used in the health system? And is there a competitor to Isabel already out there?
I would have said it's not used anything like as widely as it should be. I mean, for me, this is such a fundamental part of medicine that it should be a sort of routine tool, as routine as a stethoscope, or people still using stethoscopes. But you know, the challenge we found is there is a certain level of resistance among clinicians to tools like this, and I think it's changing. I think people are gradually becoming more receptive to tools like this. So, you know, it's used across, you know, a few hundred institutions in the States. It's used across the state of Queensland, but within those institutions, it's probably only used by, I don't know, a quarter to a third of clinicians. So it's certainly not a routine item. Is there a competitor on the professional side? There's probably the oldest tool around, which is called D-Explain, but that's a rules-based system. There's a tool that's specialized, really focused on visual diseases, called Visual DX. But that's, you know, I'd say more of a dermatology type database. So on the professional side, I don't really see any competitors that, if you put them feature, can compete. On the patient side, there's much more competition in the sort of noise area, but again, you know, you need to test them. You know, if you decide you want a tool like this, you should probably come up with criteria to test it, and then decide what's important for you. I mean, the key difference that Isabel that will mark it out against anything is, as I said, its ability to cope with multiple clinical features entered in free text. And I think having tools that only work with a very limited set of symptoms, or one symptom, or, you know, things that only cover a few hundred diseases are not that useful.
Thank you so much.
There have only been two, there are two studies, independent reviews, which we put on our website, which compare these tools, and you should read those as well.
I think I'm safe now to say thank you, Jason. Please join me in welcoming and thanking Jason Maude.
Thank you very much.